Good morning. I think we'll just wait just a couple seconds to have a lot of people log in. It looks like there's quite a few people logging in, and we'll get started very, very shortly. We have quite a few people registered this morning, which is very exciting. And it'll just take a little bit of time for everybody to log in.
We've got Texas, we've got Dublin, we've got Mexico.
Truly international webinar, which is what we were hoping for. So
England and Sacramento, Canada.
Bonjour, Gabby.
Hola, hola.
Are we considering Texas as a whole other country?
It was just the first one that came up.
We better be careful about that one.
I think they like it when you do. I don't think anybody's going to be insulted.
Well, as everyone's starting to log in, maybe we'll get started because we have quite a few panelists and some exciting topics this morning. I want to welcome you. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're located. I'm Chuck Lennox from the United States, based in Seattle, Washington. I'm representing the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation. And the Alliance is a group of 7 heritage associations around the world that have formed as a group to work together to strengthen the profession and provide support for others for doing this important work. Before I get kind of introduce today's topic, I just want to make a mention that we want to thank Time Looper for their sponsorship of the Spanish translation. And if you're listening to this as a Spanish speaker and don't understand anything I'm saying, at the very bottom of your screen, press the interpretation button, and Spanish is available. Spanish translation is available for you at that point. We're very excited today to be launching a series of webinars providing examples of global excellence in heritage interpretation. Each of the Alliance groups will be presenting a session for the entire spring, almost one a month, and hosting a different session. Today, we're going to begin with the National Association for Interpretation in the United States, kicking off this session. Before I turn the screen over to Amy, I just want to say that my thoughts are with my Ukrainian colleagues this morning. We anticipate a group of visitors next month. We're keeping our fingers crossed, but we want to send our thoughts and prayers to them. Now I'd like to turn the screen over to Amy Lethbridge from NAI, who will start our first webinar. Amy.
Great, well, welcome everybody. We're at 126 participants from all over the world. So thank you for joining us for this important topic. I'm Amy Lethbridge. I work in Los Angeles for a regional open space agency, and I'm the founder of a nonprofit called Community Nature Connection and serve on the board of NAI. Issues of justice, diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility are important and core to our mission at NAI. If interpreters are the keepers, the tellers, and facilitators of stories of our cultural and natural resources, then we have a responsibility to really understand the stories that are told and to richly represent all people, all backgrounds, and all perspectives. Whose stories are we telling? Who's telling it? Who's not coming? How do we make all visitors feel welcome and included at our sites? Who's not coming, and why are there barriers to access? These are big topics, so we'll get right to it. We have a panel today that represents government, nonprofits, and private firms, all with important perspectives to share. So thank you, panelists, for joining us. And I'm going to start asking you to introduce yourself, where you work, and your particular interest or perspective on these issues. And Elwood, why don't we start with you?
Well, welcome to the meeting, and I'm honored to be here. My name is Elwood York. I'm the CEO of a nonprofit called Conservation Legacy. We are allegedly the largest conservation youth organization in the country that does the type of work we do in the United States. I am he and him in terms of how my pronouns. And I'm here because this is very important. I tease my DEI person that I am actually trying to put her out of business. And she laughs and says, yeah, I'm trying to get put out of business as well. We are very keen on why people visit the outdoors, what makes them come, and we want them to have a great experience. Our organization does a lot of work internally and externally to express how open the outdoors and nature should be for people of all walks, all colors, all creeds, and all kinds. So with that, I'll stop, but I'll only like to add one thing. We're a national organization. We have people in our organization from California to Vermont to Maine to the Caribbean to Guam. So we are very, very attuned to trying to be inclusive and have equity and justice work for all that we encounter. So thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elwood. Casey, how about to you?
Thanks, Amy, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you as well for the opportunity to be here. My name is Casey Brees. I use they, them pronouns, and I am an education and outreach program manager with City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks, located in Boulder, Colorado, which is also the ancestral lands of several indigenous peoples, including, but certainly not, exclusive to the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations. The approach that Open Space and Mountain Parks takes to this work is similar to what Elwood was mentioning with his, is this multi-pronged approach, really focusing on our operational practices and policies that support our services on the ground, our programs and our projects, and our facilities. And this is all done in an effort to really diversify stewardship and ultimately diversify interpretation and outdoor work in general. So I'm really looking forward to learning and participating with you all today. Thank you.
Thanks, Casey. And now I'll lob it to Janet.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am just located actually outside of Atlanta, Georgia, so it's just afternoon time, Eastern time here. Very happy to be joining the other panelists today and appreciate the invitation. My name is Janet Labreck, and I am here representing the company 3D Photo Works and Tactile Images, and I encourage you all to take the opportunity to visit tactileimages.com and take a look at some of the amazing innovative technology that is out there today to support individuals with a wide range of disabilities who definitely engage in, interpretation, and certainly participate in museum experience, science center experiences, and really want to bring to this panel today the representation of the disability community, which is broad, but also has some very specific, I think, issues related to some of these types of environments and ways to increase accessibility and inclusion as well as diversity. So again, happy to be joining you today.
Great, thanks, Janet. And lastly, but not least, Brady Mckellar.
Hi, everybody. My name's Brady Mckellar. My pronouns are he, they, and I am the managing director for Vermilionville, which is a living history museum in South Louisiana. We are on the ancestral homes of the Attakapaw people and also the Chitimacha tribe. And part of the work that we do at Vermilionville is sort of sharing the unique cultural histories of the different peoples that contributed their experiences to our contemporary folk life here in Acadiana. And that's the Native American people, Africans that were pushed up during slave trade, and then of course the Acadians that came down out of Nova Scotia into this area. And so because so much of the work that we do is in sharing these cultures, we want to make sure that we are taking every step to make sure that not only are we sharing the histories of those cultures accurately, but we're also sharing the contemporary culture accurately by making sure that we are a place that meets some of those underserved members of our community. We've also taken a number of big steps lately that I'm very proud of to make sure that everyone that comes to our site can have the fullest possible experience, regardless of what disabilities may be impacting their trip out to Vermilionville. And I just want to thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be part of such an auspicious group, and it's a great panel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all of you for being here. Let's start with, from a management perspective, let's start with organizations and agencies themselves. How do we incorporate JEDI principles and practices and commitment at all levels in our organizations and agencies? And again, Elwood, I'm going to start with you since you're a CEO. Talk about what you're doing at Conservation Legacy.
Wow. Well, we have actually a full-blown, full-blooded DEI program. We have mandatory trainings. We have cultural humility trainings. We have all kinds of, we even have a space at our organization that diverse people can just come together in a safe place and talk. And it helps with the unity. We do book readings. We do those things that offer you an opportunity to reach out and to learn about other cultures and to learn about other people. Sometimes you find that in using the he, him, her, she, they pronouns, that now you figure you know the person. You don't have to reach out anymore. They already told you. But you don't know anything about them. You don't know what they like, what they do. So we try to give you that first level of intro, and then we try to get into your head. The thing that your grandparents told you a long time ago is actually true. Birds of a feather tend to flock together, but only human beings have the ability to cross species. Only the human beings have the ability to be vulnerable enough to learn something about someone else. So we try to encourage that interaction. When you spoke of government, I come from the government. I used to be the wilderness director from the Forest Service. From the top, you have to push cultural diversity and environmental justice down. But there needs to be people on the ground, the middle manager who helps push it up and make sure that it's treated with the dignity and the respect that it should. And if you're looking to work inside that paradigm, find a godmother or godfather, someone who can help you navigate those things and bring those issues to fore, that gives you some comfort and top or bottom cover as you open up these issues for discussion, because we all have something to contribute. We just have to figure out how. And that is not my dog. I just want to know, I do have one, but that is not mine. Okay, but that is what I'd like to add at this point. Thank you.
Great, thanks. How about the rest of the panelists in terms of organization? Casey?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Elwood. Just to kind of build on that, an approach that we have taken has really focused on how do we involve staff at every level of leadership and tenure and service area. So like, absolutely agree that leadership level is very important, having somebody to model what the expectation is and what the behavior is. And then also including people who are on the ground, people who are interacting with our visitors on a daily basis, all the way up through those middle managers, people who are responsible for communications, for trainings, and coming together and really building this comprehensive program around what is the need for our organization and how do we get there together, and really lifting up voices and perspectives from across the entire department and organization. A lot of what we've done has focused on training. We do have a lot of mandatory trainings, but we also set the tone day one when folks come to work with us, whether they are standard staff and they're going through like a citywide training focused on racial equity, or our seasonal and temporary staff even coming for first day of their season. And we're having conversations about race. We're having conversations about privilege and power, and how to support each other in this work and in our identities and beyond. So I think that, yeah, really having that approach of, as an organization, really identifying it as a priority, having a budget for it, having that leadership support, and as a government agency, having policy guidance around it is also really beneficial.
Fantastic, thank you. Brady or Janet?
I think that, and I mean, I'll probably say this repeatedly over the course of the day, but I think so much of it comes from having open communication and open dialogue, where you work. It's kind of a situation, and it's a phrase we use a lot, like, you don't know what you don't know. And so I think that from the top down, there has to be an understanding of what are the needs of the people that you work with. And then how can you make sure that those needs are being met? And we talked a lot about like, how are we serving the underserved communities that are around us? And then I think the question also is, do you have members of that underserved community that work with you? And if you don't, why not? And maybe that's a key step that leadership should be working from the top is, what are your hiring processes? How are you bringing people in? And are you making sure that your workplace is a diverse workplace? And like I said, especially when it comes down to, communities that are underserved or are historically underserved, are you creating a place for them in your organization? Because that's going to be the singular best way to make sure that you hear that voice.
Fantastic point. And Janet, before we go to you, there is a question asking for you to talk about the name of your company again.
Sure. The name of it's actually not my company, but it's 3D Photo Works /Tactile Images, and the website is tactileimages.com. And I represent this company for a couple of different reasons. Number one, in my former capacity and role with the Obama administration, I served as the commissioner under his administration, serving the vocational rehabilitation programs across the country, as well as island and territories. And in that capacity, looking at all of these issues, JEDI issues, specific issues relative to diversity from a disability perspective is absolutely critical. Oftentimes we have conversations, we have initiatives, we have certain types of policies, regulations that speak specifically to increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging for various communities. However, oftentimes individuals with disabilities are not represented sometimes in those conversations, nor are they represented sometimes in the actual initiatives. And in particular, the 3D Photo Works and Tactile Images company is specifically there for you as the various communities that serve individuals, whether you're a cultural institution of museums, science centers, other cultural activities that occur in the community, that Tactile Images specifically has designed technology, 3D technology, and it's not the traditional 3D technology that we are often maybe familiar with in the past. This is very much digital technology, allowing for the replication of 2D images that get transferred specifically into 3D images via a platform and exhibit, thereby allowing for the opportunity to actually recreate and replicate a painting, for example. I am blind myself, and 4 out of 6 of my siblings are. We have very little opportunity previously to really actively participate in various types of cultural institutions, specifically museums environments, because oftentimes those environments, although they might be physically accessible, they're not necessarily programmatically accessible. Being able to really experience the art, the initiatives, and the activities that may be happening in those types of settings and environments where the public comes in. And so looking at innovation, looking at technology, looking at your opportunity, I think, to have policies that are specifically designed to make sure that, first of all, that you're providing a service or a support or an experience, whether it's indoors or outdoors, that that experience truly does represent the opportunity for various communities, various individuals, various disability groups to enjoy the same type of experience that anyone else would have that opportunity. And oftentimes that comes about by utilizing technology in ways that we haven't necessarily thought about how to use technology.
Oh, Amy, you are muted.
Yes, because that was my dog barking. Janet, if you could just adjust your camera a little bit up so we can see all of you, that's perfect. And
Okay,
let's keep going on what Janet was saying in terms of programming, both personal and non-personal methods to address these JEDI issues in programming. And if you have examples, please share them. So very specifically, whether it's the guide on the trail or in the museum or your signage, what are ways to address and incorporate these issues? And I'll take a hand for whoever would like to go first. Brady.
Well, at Vermilionville, just over the past, I guess it was about 4 years ago at this point, it was one of these very sort of like strange kismet moments, whereas I was driving into work, I had heard an interview on NPR where they were talking about tours for the blind at museums. And then a friend of mine came in and she was talking about how a friend of hers has a child with autism and that they have a really difficult time planning trips out as a family because there are special needs and considerations that need to be taken into account. And if there aren't, then it can basically end your entire family outing very quickly. And then someone else also brought up, a unique need that was something that we could address on our end. And so almost immediately in this moment, we started talking about what would the process be for us to be able to create special opportunities and tours that were geared specifically to meet the needs of people with sensory processing differences. And so we met with our local community organization, we met with the university, members from the Autism Society of America came to give us some feedback. And over time, we were able to develop a tour that had many more hands-on elements and was also focused on making sure that the visitor and their support teams were well prepared in terms of what they could expect. As they turned a corner, we wanted to make sure that before they turned that corner, they knew that there were going to be animals or that there were going to be different smells or there were going to be loud sounds so that they could prepare to step into that new environment. And then we also created spaces for quiet rooms or other waiting spaces. And we took some of our crafts and we readjusted how we teach those crafts to go in a much more step-by-step process that also included photographs of what each step could look like. And we've had really, really wonderful success. And it's given us an opportunity again to be a service to the member of our communities that don't have opportunities to really come out and explore a museum in this way.
Great, and great example of exactly what Janet was talking about in terms of really involving and incorporating the folks you want to serve in the program planning and discussion of what their needs are. Great example. Who else has something? Elwood, I know you have thoughts on signage.
Yes, my thoughts. Signage is always interesting. As the wilderness person, we are somewhat the prudes in the government in terms of outdoors. In wilderness, it has to be untrammeled and you can't have any motorized or mechanized equipment. But when you would get to the wilderness area, there was just a sign. It wasn't in any other language. It was just a sign. If you needed, if you were visually challenged, there's no braille, there's no audio, there's nothing. It was just a sign. And I worked on in Los Angeles, which is probably the most diverse community on earth. eh, I think the voting ballot has like 20 different languages. But the sign was a basic sign in English. So if you couldn't speak English and you didn't know it was a wilderness area, you were committing all kinds of public offenses because you were taking the inappropriate instruments into wilderness. You couldn't read the sign, the ranger would get you. Your weekend is spoiled and you thought you were doing the right thing. So we found that going back and looking at our signage made such a difference in visitor experience that we actually reached out to hire several different consultants to change even how the signage looked. Um, to have some kind of solar-based audio that you could trigger. For those people who have phones, you could connect your Bluetooth and get a guide in your ear. There are all kinds of things. The other problem is, and I'll stick with wilderness, if you are physically impaired and need a wheelchair, you cannot take a extra boosted up wheelchair into wilderness. They actually want you to take the wheelchair that you use in your home out on a wilderness trail, which makes absolutely no sense. So we had to step that process back and say, if you want people to appreciate it, we must accommodate them in certain ways. So signage, how you approach the maps, how they're written, how they're displayed, are all so critical in getting everyone to understand how they can enjoy the area and participate to the fullness. So, yeah, that's my real concern about signage. I would like to add that in our organization, our DEI agenda and training is as critical as any other training that we do. We have mandatory trainings on cultural humility, cultural differences. We have like drop-in sessions for DEI where people can just walk in and talk about what I need or what I see or what I think. And we make it a safe space where no one feels like if I speak up, I'll be ostracized, or if I have something to say, I won't be listened to. And as the CEO, I often drop in and I don't allow my picture to be shown. I'll just drop in anonymously so that I can hear, so that there's no intimidation like, oh my God, the boss is on the Zoom. I try to come in so that I can listen. And I think if any of you are at the level that you're the COO or the CEO of any kind of organization, sometimes it's great to just anonymously sit down and listen to what your members and your people have to say, and you'd be surprised at the things that you're walking past that you weren't even aware were problems, because no one wants to go to the boss all the time and say I got a problem, but it is a problem. So I would suggest that as well, that we take a more humble approach to listening and learning. And I still have ouch moments. Sharina, my DEI lady, constantly reminds me of, you got to be careful, Mr. York, you're still a dinosaur. So we get there though, but thank you.
Great. Janet or Casey on programming? Casey?
I would love to hop in. Thanks. Just to kind of echo what Brady and Janet also said about that participatory design and decision making. I think that really is where that amplification of a community's perspective and their needs can really take place. With open space and mountain parks, we've taken that approach in a few different ways. We've partnered with community organizations to co-design signage, for instance, to not only meet the needs of specifically our Spanish-speaking community, but also people of all languages, and people of different ages and maybe different reading abilities as well. We also are currently in the process of working with federally recognized Indigenous tribes and nations in co-creating curriculum and interpretive media to serve one of our sites that was recently renamed. And I think something that comes up for me a lot, and try to not like over tell this story, but I think like we all really want to do the right thing, and we all want to have really welcoming facilities and programs. But I think it's really important to stop and think about any unintended consequences of what you might be trying to do. And one example that I think of frequently is several years ago, an email went around our department that we were all getting really excited about some signs to put up at all of our facilities saying, everyone's welcome here, in a variety of languages and with the trans and LGBT or LGBTQ, rainbow flag and things like that. But, the question came up of, are we really ready for that, right? Are our facilities really accessible for everybody? Does everybody have the kind of training around, cultural sensitivity and competency to be able to support anybody who walks through the door? Do we have staff who are multilingual? Sometimes, a lot of times, being of a marginalized identity or historically excluded community, you can almost feel targeted in a way and almost trapped if somebody welcomes you into a space, but then they can't actually support you in that way. So I think that with whatever it is you are working toward, whether that is that participatory design, whether it is an exhibit or a program, curriculum, facilities, or even operationalizing Jedi values, just really be thinking a few steps down the road and think about what else might come up if you begin that work and if you're introducing that to the community.
That's a really powerful point. Thank you for sharing that, Casey.
I think also it's if I may just also add to that, I think particularly relative to programming, but I'm also thinking specifically about partnerships, and that oftentimes we talk about partnerships. Everyone knows that it's really important to have those partnerships. Everyone knows that it's really important to get outside of yourself as an organization or as an individual to really think about ways that you can promote those partnerships, but also not just only promote them on paper and in discussion, but in activity and sort of having that, taking that step, that moves you beyond just the conversation and moves you towards implementation. And that oftentimes, sometimes that there's a struggle, between when you're looking at, for example, what it might cost, depending on what that activity or what the exhibit might be. Oftentimes, though, we make assumptions that, that it's either going to be too costly or too intrusive, or might not have the employee demand that you might necessarily think that you need. But I'm raising partnerships for a specific reason, and that is because it's those partnerships that really do help us to step outside of ourselves and to step outside of our own assumptions about whether or not you can actually implement, whether or not you actually have the right people at the table, those conversations that make assumptions about cost, certainly about interest, and does that cost factor drive the interest, and will there be an adequate return on investment, when oftentimes when you're thinking more universally in both approach and design and operationalizing in an initiative or an activity or an exhibit, that oftentimes that innovation comes, from those looking at those various approaches in terms of how certainly those partnerships can actually contribute and benefit and move you outside of yourself or outside of your organization, and certainly leverage both expertise, costs, as well as the overall experience, and certainly looking at the data and metrics of things. How it was successful, was it successful? Can we replicate it? And oftentimes we need to think about those kinds of situations that really can help us to get to those places where we are moving outside of ourselves.
I'm sorry, I
Great.
want to be respectful of time, but I want to jump in for just one more sentence. I promise it'll be quick. And it's something that Casey brought up, but then Janet brought up again. And a lot of it deals with, like, as we're talking about making these changes or developing new programs, cost is always that issue. But the program that I just talked about that we were able to develop at Vermilionville, I mean, it cost virtually nothing. I mean, maybe $300. And a lot of that was in like non-consumable materials. And so there are a lot of great things that you can do to start making Jedi positive changes at your site. And like one of the first things is in language. And yes, I mean, like, in what language do you have things available, but also in the words that you and your frontline interpreters are using. Like, always focus on person first language. And just that is going to be a very impactful step that costs absolutely nothing. And so there are a lot of great ways that you can start the ball rolling on these kind of Jedi positive changes without having to have too much of a concern about what that cost is going to be in terms of dollars.
Absolutely. And we have a question following up on the programming conversation. We talked about signage, but in programs themselves, in theme development, in content development, what are some of the ways we can share with the audience in terms of making sure our programming is truly representative and is telling stories from all perspectives?
Yeah, could I please let me jump in? I've had that happen to me most recently. We have a huge ancestral lands program in my organization, and some of the indigenous people were complaining about the training. And I'm like, what's the problem? It's medical training. And they said, well, they told me in order to tell whether or not a person's in shock or the injury, if it's white, pink, and cool. You're talking to a bunch of indigenous natives. You're not gonna find a whole bunch of white, pink, and cool. And they're like, who thought this was a good training for us? Well, what did I learn? So I think sometimes when you bring in people doing training, you have to be familiar with your audience. And the training needs to comport to what's actually relevant to them. And so that happened most recently. I wanted to bring it up because it was actually, it was not funny, but they actually joked about it. The guy was like, Mr. York, this is ridiculous. If somebody gets hurt on the res, it's highly likely they're not going to be white, pink, or cool. So what am I really looking for? And so I think we need to also, in trying to do the right thing, look at our training to make sure that we haven't caused a impractical situation when we're actually hoping to do better. So yeah, I wanted to bring that up. As you look at those programmatic offerings you bring in, make sure that they're culturally sensitive and relevant. And I think your audience will enjoy it more.
Brady?
No, I think I think as most things, you want to make sure that you're following the mission of your organization. That should always be, a guiding element. But I think another step, just in terms of developing programs, is, most of us in the United States of America were not the first people on the land that we are currently standing. And I think that if you are trying to create a program that is going to be more inclusive of stories, then find ways to make those connections with your Native American tribal partners. Like Casey was talking about the work that they've been doing with a number of their tribes in the region. And that's such a great way to start developing not only a project that meets Jedi guidelines, but also something that's going to be a much more richer version of storytelling than you're going to get if you're following just precise written history that came from colonists. One of the things that we're trying to do at Vermilionville right now is I've got an exhibit space, and because we've heard a lot of really very cool oral history about what this space was like before colonists came here. We know that there used to be a spring where various tribes would meet to gather for fresh water. We know that just, I don't know, a kilometer this way, there's a point where two bayous meet that we know would have been a center point for trade. Just up the hill from where we are now, our airport sits on top of what used to be Native American mounds. And so one of the things that we're doing is trying to connect all of those great stories and collect them and present that to our guests as they come through. And so I think that kind of begin at the beginning, like find ways to connect with the Native American peoples in whose region your organization sits or straddles, and find ways to share their stories as part of what you're doing and your mission.
Absolutely. And everyone else's story as well. Often we interpret a single event at a single place when over time, many peoples were there, many events occurred there. And so I think broadening that perspective and really learning a full history so that our programs talk about everybody and everything that happened as opposed to just basically the colonist experience. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talk about about representation in the profession of interpretation. How do we create inclusive employment opportunities, making jobs accessible to different socioeconomic, ethnic, and demographic categories? And why is this important? Who wants to jump in on that?
I'll jump in. You have to take people there and explain the history and create a spark, and then make a logical connection to the authority, which is typically the government, that the story needs to be told with multiple facets. A diamond has a bunch of faces, but it's still a diamond. So as the light penetrates, it breaks off into a prism. That's still one beam of light. So as I look to bring young people from San Bernardino out to the Angeles, at first they were like, why do I want to go outside? I'm good right here. What are we doing? So those same group of kids who I first took to the Angeles or to the San Gorgonio are now doing interpretation in Coachella because they made a connection to the land and someone explained their history. But I also had to find that godfather or godmother in the Forest Service or in the Park Service who would be willing to support their efforts.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're new to a situation, anything that happens that you're uncomfortable with may tend to make you shut down. So you have to make the environment of in a way that you feel vulnerable enough to express either your lack of knowledge or lack of capacity so that you can grow along with the interpretive effort you're trying to grow. Because some things that are going to be said, especially in the US, are going to make some people uncomfortable. But that uncomfortableness is why we're a great country. We have to deal with each other and we have to learn to work with each other. And I think if you get people to feel free to be themselves, to be vulnerable enough to accept other cultures, other ideas, and other stories, you then encourage that in an employment scenario with either the government or some nonprofit that can explain their story and keep the truth multivariate as the truth often is in a historical context. Thank you.
Right.
I think I'd like to add to that also. I think that, when you're thinking about employment, oftentimes when we think about what happens in the employment experience for any individual seeking employment, And oftentimes they're responding specifically to a set of skill sets, some information about the company, information about the role that the person, will be playing. And it's very much oftentimes a cookie cutter approach in terms of, recruiting and hiring individuals and then thinking about retention. Well, if the pandemic hasn't done anything, it's really taught us about how people feel about their employment statuses now, what people expect, from their employment experience, the skill sets, that people need to acquire and have, but also it's also about work balance as well. And that oftentimes when you think about what we're asking somebody to do, to represent a company or an organization, that oftentimes we want to make sure that we're not actually putting forth barriers for those individuals. Oftentimes, specifically when we're thinking about the disability community, and especially in the blindness community, oftentimes assumptions are made that, well, we can't really have this person do that job because we don't know how to get by this particular barrier, or you unintentionally are imposing barriers that may not necessarily need to be there. And that the more we can get outside of thinking about a role in an employment type of a situation and engage the community or engage the impacted individuals that you're thinking about, that we have that open mind and thinking about ways that we can alternatively identify strategies that may absolutely result in doing nothing more than benefiting your organization, benefiting the community, benefiting anyone who's participating in that type of an experience. So I think when we look at employment issues, there are all these things that we need to think about very differently. And you're hearing a lot of those discussions today. Because of the pandemic or as a result of the pandemic, you're hearing the voices of people saying, look, childcare is very important to me. It's very costly. I can't afford it, or they're saying transportation, or I don't want to spend, all of my entire work hours or work career, in certainly committing, to the role that I'm going to be playing without feeling as though that it has a specific impact on me. I want to make those contributions, but I want to feel good about it. It isn't just about money. And so I think that thinking very differently about how we solicit, how we recruit, how we hire, expectations, all of those things in combination, I think, could certainly yield very different outcomes when you're thinking about bringing someone into your organization.
Absolutely. Casey, did you?
Yeah, I would love to hop in. Thank you for that, Janet. And I'm probably going to echo a few of those things too. I think when I think of that hiring and recruitment process, for me, it's really like a timeline of events that can begin with our programs and connecting with our audiences, whether it's in our museums or in the field or what have you. And for us, as a government agency, as a local land management agency, it's connecting with our students when they come on field trips and sort of building that pathway, right? And we're still kind of working out what that looks like from the very first field trip to full-time standard employment, but really sparking that interest in this type of work, and then creating opportunities along the way to get more and more and more involved. And so we focus a lot on youth, at least my team does. And so we take those opportunities with the younger students, and even before school, we have family opportunities. And it moves into like our junior ranger program that is designed for high school students. And then, we look at internships and volunteer opportunities, and we engage with, and we're fortunate to be part of a college community. And then, you get to that kind of what you were speaking to, that recruitment phase. And you really do have to examine how you're marketing those positions and where you're marketing those positions. You have to look at your position descriptions and figure out like what skills and experiences are actually necessary for a position versus what could be taught, right? And a lot of times we end up weeding out a lot of really great candidates just in the language that we choose to use in our recruitment efforts. And of course, even just like the interview process itself, for anybody who's applied for a government job, the application process can be very, very tedious. I see Elwood laughing. It is, it's a lot. And so also providing opportunities to teach people to make that a more accessible process. And then when you do hire people on, you need to make sure that your culture is ready for that, right? You need to make sure that they feel supported once they are hired and once they're working with you. And that gets back to also what you said, Janet, about, that work-life balance. And it's not, we're not just cogs in a machine, but we do have cultures that are really supportive of each other, and they're open and honest, and we can have conversations, and people's goals are supported and both professionally and personally.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just want to add, I work for a government open space agency, and for the longest time, every job announcement required a college degree in the natural resources. And yet, if I'm looking for someone to do community work, I value experience with that community and language. I don't need you to be a biologist. But it was sort of historic barriers that we weren't even really paying attention to. And then we went through and we redid all the job announcements, really thinking about what is the job and what are we valuing. And then the other great point you made, Casey, that you want to be a place where people want to work. You can do all this great recruitment, and then if you come and people feel isolated or not welcome, they're not going to stay. And you've missed an opportunity. Brady, did you want to add to the employment discussion?
Not really. I think that I could, but I would think I would just be echoing things that were said. If we want better diversity amongst interpreters, then we have to make sure that we have a strong diversity of people that, as children and young adults, are going to visit these parks and museums and historic sites, and they find something there that inspires them to take that step up. So we really got to start diversity with who is visiting our sites if we want to, in the future, have a more diverse interpretive force around the country and around the world.
Absolutely. So last question, this has all gone by very quickly, but we talked about, in telling everyone's story and making sure we present a diverse perspective, that can be very uncomfortable for some audiences and some interpreters. So what are examples of training and support you can give your interpretive staff to put them when they're out there with potentially hostile, or at least I'll say hostile members of the public who don't appreciate the diverse perspective you're offering? Any great examples of training and ways to support staff?
I'll try one example that I often use personally. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy. And you often see people with the Confederate flag, which is actually not the Confederate flag. The stars and bars are actually the battle flag of Richmond and Robert E. Lee. So often when I see people with that, I ask them, are they from Richmond? And they go, no, why would you ask? I say, well, you're wearing the battle flag of Richmond. And they go, no, this is a Confederate flag. And I go, no, the Confederate flag is actually a white sheet with a red X, which is actually the state flag of Florida. And when you start an educative conversation with people and they go, wow, I didn't know that. And it's not you racist, I want this, or you're this color, or whatever. We're talking about something that we both know a little bit about, and that eases that tension a little bit, because you're giving away some education, you're letting them express themselves, and then as you try to do the interpretive part, they're more willing to take the information you're trying to impart because you've offered them a little piece of information about themselves. I saw Deidre Harris was asked something about the Civil War and people being uncomfortable. Well, hell, the guy lives across the street from me got a Confederate flag on his mailbox. but his grandfather or great grandfather fought in the war. I'm not mad at him about that, but we need to talk about it. So you have to find a way in interpretive explanation to give a little in an inintrusive way that helps a person lower the barrier of conflict, and then you can ease into those areas that are uncomfortable and maybe even find out why.
Yeah.
And once you find out why, you may actually be able to reach them in a place that no one else has. And that's usually what I suggest when you're trying to deal with those things that are uncomfortable. Find a mutual ground that we both can be comfortable in and try and grow from there. So I hope I help Deidre out a little bit, because I often encounter that in my neighborhood. So thank you.
Brady?
I think that, I mean, I think there's two things. One, I think you want to make sure that your team is equipped with the absolute best factual information. But then two, and I mean, there are great workshops that people can take. There are wonderful books that deal with interpreting difficult topics and interpreting difficult history. But my recommendation is to have your team take some like conversation facilitation training, because especially when someone comes at them aggressively or angrily, and I'm in Louisiana, I was born in Mississippi, I understand exactly what Elwood is saying about the way some of these people have pieced together their version of what happened in the early 1800s and the 1860s, and they get very, very upset if they find out these things aren't true, because there's like a sense of ancestral shame that comes to them, or they feel like what they have been taught is wrong. And so that's a great opportunity to come in with some real facilitation training in conversation, so that you can make sure that that stays at a very reasonable level. And then maybe you can get to the point of exchange, like Mr. Elwood was saying, where you can have an exchange. Nobody's going to learn anything if they're angry. And a very good friend of mine that works with NCBI always says that, like, you don't change a person's mind, you change a person's heart. And I think that especially when we're dealing with these types of challenging stories, that having that kind of conversation control will help you get into them in a way that you can impact, the way that they feel about a situation, or about the personhood, or about the quest for freedom. And then you can kind of lay the facts on them, and then they can walk away having a positive experience overall.
And this is Janet. I would like to add to that also, because oftentimes when you think about interpretation, and when you think about when people come into specific environments expecting to have a certain type of experience, and I'll reflect back for a moment, to the disability community, particularly in any kind of a setting that's a public setting where they would like to participate, but they come in, not expecting to participate, but then leaving with the disappointment that they weren't able to really interpret or really participate, in the way that they thought they might be able to. And I think that it's important to think about, when you're having these types of exhibits and opportunities for the public to come in, that you're not setting the stage for misinterpretation. And so I think that one of the, a good example, of that, I remember for myself, as well as the experience for other people with disabilities, oftentimes didn't like to go into museums, particularly because we were always told, you can't touch this. You have to stay X number of feet, away from this particular painting because of the cost, of the painting. Well, then the interpretation of that then is not anymore about the art, it's about the security or the protection of it. It's really not about the experience of people who might need a different way, to interpret. So when you're thinking about creating those types of experiences, are you really promoting that type of an environment and experience where people can self-interpret, where people can, in fact, participate? And then also thinking more innovatively and creatively about, the role that technology can play. The News Museum did an exhibit in 2018 with the Battle of Hue 1968 in Vietnam. And it was a great exhibit, but John Olson with Tactile Images decided, well, what if we took those same images for that particular exhibit and we made it more accessible and inclusive for people, not only who are blind or visually impaired, but they may have cognitive challenges, they may have perceptual problems, you know, that they need to have text, they need to have auditory, you know, response or feedback in order to better interpret and participate in that experience. They did it, they took the risk and they did it. And what they expected to be a 3-month engagement for that particular exhibit turned out to be a 15-month exhibit, and 1.2 million people, visitors actually to those exhibits later. They were absolutely floored that the complement of the tactile images and that auditory response, tactile kinesthetic experience, meaning centimeters that are also embedded in the exhibit, really contributed greatly, not only to people who are blind or visually impaired, but even to the general public who were noticing things about the specific exhibit that they would have never have noticed if they were just looking at a picture or self-interpreting, you know, what they were actually seeing. So thinking about ways that you can move beyond just that individual experience, you know, for that particular type of exhibit or experience that's in a cultural setting is really important also, and can change the whole perception of who you thought your audience is versus who you now know your audience is. And you can absolutely think about replicating that in different ways and building on that.
That's great. Thank you for that, Janet. And we are out of time. Clearly, we needed 2 hours in AI. And there's lots of great questions in the questions, and I know some of the panelists are willing to sit and look through them and maybe figure out how we can respond to those questions after the fact. But I'm gonna turn it back over to Chuck.
Thank you very much to our panelists and for Amy for facilitating, and for everyone who attended. Just to let you know that you'll receive a email when the recording of this English and Spanish version of this webinar, and that'll be posted to the Global Alliance website. And we want to remind people that the next webinar is on April 7th with Interpret Europe, and so be on the lookout for that registration link. Thank you very much for attending this morning. It's been a very exciting time, morning, afternoon, or evening. It's been a very exciting time for us to launch this series and for us to begin to work together as interpreters around the world.
Thank you.
You,
It's
everybody.
been an honor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.